I just missed it. I missed the closeness of an audience, of a live audience. So just as soon as I got out of the movie contracts, I started to do live performances again.
For decades, fans were told the same story, that Elvis Presley never toured overseas because his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, didn't have a passport. It was clean, simple, easy to believe. But like most things in Elvis's life, the truth wasn't simple at all. Because the real reason the king of rock and roll never left America wasn't about paperwork or permission. It was about something far deeper, darker, and more personal than anyone dared to admit. By the late 1960s, Elvis was a global phenomenon. His name alone could sell out arenas from Tokyo to London. Royal families sent invitations. Governments offered private jets. There were open checks from promoters across Europe, Australia, even Saudi Arabia, all begging for a single tour. But every time, the answer was the same: number. He would smile politely, say, "Maybe someday," and change the subject. Behind the charm, there was a silence that unsettled even his closest friends. Because Elvis didn't just avoid touring overseas, he avoided talking about it altogether. And when someone pressed too far, that smile would fade. His voice would drop. He'd simply say, "It's better this way," and walk out of the room. On paper, the excuse made sense. Colonel Tom Parker, the man who discovered, molded, and ultimately controlled Elvis, was secretly an undocumented immigrant. Born Andreas van Kook in the Netherlands, he had entered the U.S. illegally, abandoned his past, and reinvented himself as the Colonel. If Elvis ever performed outside American borders, Parker risked exposure, even deportation. It was the perfect cover story, and for years it worked. Fans blamed Parker. Insiders pitied Elvis. But those who were there knew the truth wasn't so one-sided. Because there were moments, quiet, private ones, when it was Elvis himself who refused to go. Friends recalled how, after his army service in Germany, he returned home a changed man. Not just older, not just famous, but haunted. He would tell small stories that never quite made sense. Nights without sleep, things he'd seen that he didn't want to remember. But the clearest shift came when his mother, Gladys, died while he was stationed overseas. The guilt cut deep. He wasn't there when she passed. He wasn't there to say goodbye. For the rest of his life, Elvis would connect leaving America with losing the only person who ever truly grounded him. So when Parker brought up overseas tours, Elvis didn't argue. He just went quiet. "We'll stick to home," he'd say, as if the decision had already been made. It wasn't fear of flying. It wasn't politics. It was something more like superstition, an unspoken belief that leaving again meant tempting fate. By the early 1970s, the world couldn't understand why the biggest star on Earth wouldn't leave his own country. Fans wrote letters, begging for concerts in London, Tokyo, Paris. Even the Beatles joked about it publicly. "We had to come to America to meet Elvis. Maybe he'll come to England to meet us." But he never did. Not once. And yet, his voice did travel. His records broke barriers in countries he never saw. His music became an anthem for kids who didn't even speak English. He had conquered the world without ever stepping on its soil. But to the people closest to him, it wasn't triumph. It was tragedy. Because while the world saw a man worshipped by millions, those around him saw someone quietly trapped. Elvis would sometimes stand on the balcony of Graceland, looking out past the gates and into the night, and say things like, "I've seen enough of the world." But there was something in his tone, not pride, not contentment, just resignation. As if the man who once dreamed of flying higher than anyone else had finally accepted his own invisible cage. It was easy to blame the Colonel, and for good reason. Parker never missed a chance to keep Elvis under his thumb. Every tour, every movie, every contract was designed to keep him busy, exhausted, and obedient. But even if Parker had handed him the world, Elvis might still have refused to take it, because deep down, the thought of leaving America again, of being so far from home, from his mother's memory, from the land that built him, filled him with a dread he never learned to explain. He sang songs about freedom, but he was a man bound by ghosts, bound by loss, bound by the fear that if he left again, he might never come back. And that's the part no one ever told the fans. The reason Elvis Presley, the most famous man alive, never toured the world wasn't that he couldn't, it's that he wouldn't. Not because of Colonel Parker's passport, but because of something far more human. Something only the people who truly knew him ever saw. The quiet truth behind the legend. That sometimes, the king of rock and roll was still just a boy from Tupelo, too heartbroken to ever leave home again. Colonel Tom Parker was more than just a manager. To Elvis, he was both protector and prison guard. The man who built the empire and the man who locked the gates around it. The world saw the glitz, the deals, the endless tours across America. But inside Graceland, people whispered about something else. About how Parker didn't just manage Elvis's career, he managed his soul. It started small. The Colonel would call him, "my boy," half jokingly, half possessively. He'd remind him who discovered him, who made him, who could destroy him just as easily. He wrapped his control in loyalty, convincing Elvis that every restriction was for his own good. The Colonel knows best became gospel, and Elvis, raised to respect authority, rarely challenged it. At least, not out loud. But by the early 70s, the cracks were showing. Elvis was exhausted, both physically and spiritually. The Las Vegas residencies that Parker pushed on him paid well, but they drained him. Every night he performed in the same city, singing the same songs to a different crowd of tourists, while Parker sat at the casino tables, cutting side deals and collecting commissions. Meanwhile, offers for world tours poured in: London, Tokyo, Berlin. But Parker found ways to reject them all. "It's too risky," he'd say. "Too expensive. Too complicated." And Elvis would nod, though everyone around him could tell he didn't quite believe it anymore. There were nights when he'd sit alone backstage, still in costume, staring at the floor. One of his bodyguards once recalled hearing him mutter, "I could fill Wembley tomorrow, but he won't let me." The guard asked, "Then why don't you go?" Elvis just shook his head, "Because then he'll be gone. And I don't know who I am without him." That was the secret bond between them. Dependency disguised as partnership. Parker needed Elvis's fame. Elvis needed Parker's control. It was a dance neither could stop, even when it turned toxic. The Colonel's grip wasn't just financial, it was psychological. He played on Elvis's fears, his guilt, his superstitions. After his mother's death, Parker twisted that grief into obedience. "You stay close to home, son," he'd say. "Bad luck follows you overseas." And Elvis listened, because deep down, a part of him believed it. Every few years, someone powerful would challenge the arrangement. A promoter, a friend, even Priscilla once. They'd tell him to break free, to go global, to finally see what the world had waiting for him. But by then, Parker had buried his hooks too deep. He'd remind Elvis of the chaos he'd seen abroad during his army years, the loneliness, the loss. He'd whisper that fame outside America wasn't love, it was danger. "You've got all you need right here," he'd say. "Why risk it?" And it worked, every time. Elvis would retreat, convincing himself that staying home was the safer path. But safe doesn't mean free. He began to feel the walls closing in. Graceland became less a sanctuary and more a fortress. Fans still gathered at the gates, but inside, he was alone. Surrounded by yes-men, old friends on payroll, and a manager who monitored every decision. He once told a confidant, "The Colonel doesn't own my music. He owns my life." Elvis didn't just stay in America because Parker couldn't travel. He stayed because he couldn't leave Parker behind. Touring overseas would have forced him to face the world without the man who had built the myth of Elvis Presley. And somewhere inside, he feared that without that myth, there might be nothing left. In private moments, he spoke of wanting something real, a break from the show, a chance to breathe, maybe even to see the world as a man and not as a monument. But those were dangerous thoughts, because the Colonel knew how to pull him back every time. He dangled guilt, loyalty, superstition, even God. He'd say, "Son, if it was meant to be, it would have happened already. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." And Elvis would sigh and nod, like a man surrendering to his own legend. By then, touring overseas wasn't just a missed opportunity. It had become a symbol, a mirror of everything he'd lost to the Colonel's shadow. His youth, his choices, his freedom. And yet, he never rebelled. Because for Elvis, rebellion wasn't in his nature. Devotion was. Even if that devotion meant living in a gilded cage, surrounded by gold records that no longer meant joy. He once said, "People think I've seen the world. Truth is, I've barely seen past the gate." And maybe that's the saddest part. Because while the world thought Colonel Parker stopped Elvis from leaving, the truth was, he'd taught him to never even try. There are things Elvis never talked about, even to those who loved him most. Moments that lived between the lines of his songs, flashes of pain buried beneath the fame. Everyone saw the smile, the laughter, the jumpsuits. But the people who stayed up with him at 3 in the morning knew better. They knew there was something in him that never healed. Something he carried quietly, like a cross too heavy to set down. It began long before the Vegas years, before the pills, before the spotlight turned cruel. It began in Germany, a chapter Elvis rarely mentioned but never escaped. When he left for military service in 1958, he was already the most famous man alive. The Army didn't see a superstar, they saw a soldier. And for the first time since his rise, Elvis was stripped of control, stripped of family, of stage, of comfort. Then came the phone call, the one that broke him. His mother Gladys was gone. The woman who prayed over him, protected him, believed in him when no one else did, had died while he was oceans away. Elvis fell apart. Witnesses said he screamed, collapsed, and begged the officers to send him home. But by the time he reached Memphis, she was already buried. He stood over her grave, silent, trembling, staring at the ground like a man who'd lost his entire reason for living. After that, something in him changed. He returned to Germany, but the fire was gone. He finished his service, smiled for the cameras, and pretended to move on. But inside, that guilt never stopped burning. He blamed himself for leaving her, for chasing duty and fame instead of staying close. And from that moment on, overseas became more than just a place. It became a wound. Years later, when people asked why he wouldn't tour abroad, he'd joke about the Colonel or the long flights. But those close to him caught glimpses of the truth. One night, after a show in Vegas, he sat quietly with Joe Esposito and said, "You know, Joe, last time I left this country, I came back without my mama." Then he looked away, and that was the end of the conversation. He never brought it up again. The memory of that loss shadowed everything, even his music. "Are You Lonesome Tonight" wasn't just a love song. It was a prayer whispered through guilt. "Can't Help Falling in Love" wasn't just romance, it was surrender. Every lyric carried pieces of the grief he never named, and the higher he rose, the heavier that silence became. But there was another layer, one few dared to mention: the betrayal. Elvis had trusted Colonel Parker like a father figure, believing he'd protect him from the darker side of fame. Yet Parker saw that wound and turned it into leverage. He learned quickly that guilt kept Elvis compliant. Whenever promoters or friends suggested international tours, Parker would remind him, gently, manipulatively, of what happened the last time he went overseas. "You were never the same after Germany, son," he'd say. "Your mama's watching. Let's not tempt fate." Elvis would nod, haunted and obedient. Parker knew exactly which strings to pull. He didn't need to forbid Elvis from going. All he had to do was remind him of the ghosts waiting beyond the border. Over time, the line between fear and superstition blurred. Elvis began to believe he wasn't meant to leave America again, that crossing the ocean was a curse waiting to repeat itself. And as his health declined, the guilt deepened. Every time he looked at his reflection, the weight, the fatigue, the pills, he saw his mother's face staring back at him. He used to tell friends, "Mama wouldn't want to see me like this." But he kept performing anyway, as if punishing himself was the only way to make peace with her memory. The world saw a legend, confined by contracts. But inside, he was a man bound by grief. Bound by the belief that if he ever left home again, he might lose everything that was left. He didn't talk about trauma. He turned it into rhythm. Every heartbreak he couldn't confess came out through a microphone. That's why the stage was both heaven and hell for him. Every song let him escape, but every applause reminded him he was still trapped. The cheers couldn't reach the part of him that still stood at his mother's grave, 19 years old, whispering apologies into the wind. And maybe that's the secret no one wanted to see. That Elvis's refusal to tour overseas wasn't cowardice or control. It was devotion, the kind that goes beyond reason. Because for him, home wasn't about geography. It was sacred ground, the last place he'd seen her alive. And he wasn't about to leave it ever again. By 1977, Elvis Presley was a man divided between two worlds, the one the public saw and the one he quietly lived inside. To the outside world, he was still the king, a legend whose name alone could fill stadiums from London to Tokyo. But to those who knew him, he was tired, restless, haunted by a sense of finality he couldn't explain. There was one last offer on the table: Japan. A $5 million contract for just a few shows. It could have been the biggest tour of his career. But when the proposal reached him, Elvis barely looked at it. He just said softly, "I'm not leaving. Not anymore." That was the moment everyone realized the dream was over. The world had begged for decades to see him. The fans, the promoters, the press. But Elvis's world had shrunk down to the walls of Graceland. He didn't need bodyguards anymore to keep the crowds away. He needed them to keep the past out. And yet, even as his body weakened, his legend kept growing. He knew that stepping outside those gates, getting on a plane again, would mean risking everything he'd managed to hold together. So he stayed. Some called it fear. Others called it control. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was acceptance. Elvis wasn't trying to run from the world anymore. He was simply trying to make peace with it. His health was failing, the pressure unbearable, and somewhere deep down, he seemed to know he was living on borrowed time. "I don't want to die on a plane," he once told a friend. "If I go, I want to go in Memphis." There was no drama in his voice when he said it, just a quiet, steady certainty, as if he'd already decided how his story would end. Still, the irony was almost cruel. The man who once sang, "Follow that dream," had stopped following any. He'd become a prisoner of his own legend, trapped by memories of loss and a manager's shadow he could never quite escape. And yet, even in that isolation, there were moments of grace. Nights when he'd sit at the piano, alone after midnight, playing gospel songs softly under his breath. Songs that reminded him of his mother, of Tupelo, of a simpler time before the world took him. He'd close his eyes, and for a few minutes, he wasn't Elvis the superstar. He was just a man talking to God in the only language he knew. Those close to him said the last few months felt different. He smiled more, even joked again, but his eyes carried a weight, the kind of peace that comes only when a person stops fighting their own fate. He had made peace with never seeing the world, because, in a way, the world had already seen him. His music had crossed every border, touched every heart. He didn't need to travel anymore. He was already everywhere. When Japan's offer came a second time, Parker pushed hard. "Think about it, son. the biggest payday in history, but Elvis just shook his head. "Colonel, I've seen what money can't fix." Parker didn't argue after that. He just looked at him, the man he had built, the empire he had milked dry. And for the first time, he seemed to realize he couldn't control him anymore. Not truly. Elvis had already decided. He wasn't leaving. Not for Japan, not for Europe, not for anything. In August of that year, the phone calls, the schedules, the offers, all faded into silence. The last tour never happened. The last flight was never booked. Instead, Elvis spent his final days walking the halls of Graceland at night, speaking softly to the portraits on the walls, as if saying goodbye to each one. He knew the end was close, and in those quiet moments, when the lights dimmed and the crowds faded, he finally found the one thing he'd been chasing all along: peace. He didn't die on a stage. He didn't die abroad. He died in the only place that ever truly felt like home. The same ground where he dreamed, prayed, loved, and lost. Memphis, the city that made him, the city he never left. And maybe that's how it was always meant to be, because while the world begged him to cross its borders, Elvis had already crossed something far greater. From legend to legacy, from fame to eternity. He never stepped on a foreign stage, but somehow his voice did, and it's still out there, echoing through the cities he never saw, the languages he never spoke, and the hearts he never met. The man who never left America became the most recognized name on earth, not because he traveled the world, but because he made the world come to him. Maybe Elvis never toured the globe, because somewhere deep down, he knew he wouldn't have to. His story was already universal. His pain, his hope, his love, all of it lived on in every song. And in the end, that was his real tour. Not across continents, but across time. Elvis never left America, but his music never stopped moving. If you want to uncover the hidden truths behind the king, the heartbreaks, the faith, the silences the world forgot, don't miss what's coming next, because the story of Elvis Presley still isn't finished.